Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Breyer Center for Overseas Studies at Stanford. We're inaugurating this evening our fall quarter lecture series that we call Incontri a Palazzo. And there is no better way to start our fall quarter than with the lecture that Professor Lino Pertile will give us tonight on Dante and Florence. Let me tell you a little bit about Professor Pertile. I'm not about to tell you all there is to be said on him, otherwise it would take up our entire night. Lino Pertile is a Carl A. Piscosolido Professor of Romance Languages and Literatures at Harvard University. A graduate of the University of Padua, he taught Italian literature in France and in Italy and in Britain before joining Harvard University in 1995. And he went to Harvard as professor of Italian literature. At Harvard, he served as housemaster of the Elliott House, that was for 10 years. He was also named Harvard College professor in 2005. And then from 2010 to 2015, he directed the Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies at Villa Ittati. Those of you here in Florence know of it, not uniquely in Florence, but it's a very famous and beautiful place out near Fiesole, near Settignano. His research has focused on Latin and Middle Ages, on the Renaissance, and on 20th century Italian literature. He also co-edited and contributed to various volumes on Italian literature from Dante to the 20th century, including the massive Cambridge History of Italian Literature, which came out, the first edition in 1996, and then the paperback edition in 1999. His books on Dante include the following volumes: La puttana e il gigante, dal cantico dei cantici al paradiso terrestre di Dante, which got the Premio Zingarelli in 1998, La punta del disio, Semantica del desiderio nella commedia, which came out in 2005. Among his most recent essays, I will recall here Songs Beyond Mankind, Poetry and the Labor from Dante to Primo Levi. This came out in 2013. Again, welcome to Stanford University in Florence, Professor Pertile, and thank you so much for having accepted our invitation to inaugurate our fall quarter lecture series. Benvenuto.
I want to thank Dina Campani for this very warm welcome to this splendid sede at Stanford University at Firenze. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I also want to thank Fosca Dacerno, who took care of all the arrangements that went to making this a happy moment. I'm very happy to be here and to be talking about Florence in the Divine Comedy. The lecture has a subtitle that says Politics, Exile and Creativity in the Divine Comedy. You have your text, which I will probably read in English, but I might even read them in Italian occasionally. You will have the translation together with the text that I will certainly quote during my lecture. After the lecture, I'll be very happy to answer, if I can, any questions that you may have. Thank you very much for attending this event. I will begin at the very beginning of Dante's Divine Comedy, the lines that are universally known. Midway in the journey of our life, I came to myself within a dark forest where the straight way was lost. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai per una selva oscura che era dritta via la smarrita. The first verse of the Divine Comedy, midway in the journey of our life, denotes a point in time and one in space. The issue of time is easily resolved. The accepted ordinary duration of individual life in the 14th century, certainly the Middle Ages, in Dante's cultures was believed to be 70 years. Therefore, as we know that Dante was born in 1265, when he says in the middle of the journey of our life, he means 1300. And 1300 is indeed the fictional date of the journey through the other world that Dante narrates in the comedy. The issue of space is more complicated, for the journey of our life is a journey only in a metaphorical sense. This metaphor, however, is one which, for Christian culture, defines the most intrinsic meaning of human life. And it certainly defines the most intrinsic meaning of human life for Dante himself. Quite simply, life is understood to be and experienced as a journey back to a heavenly home. Life is a state of exile in a land that originally was not meant for us. In this alien land, we are travelers, pilgrims on our way home. And our desire for fulfillment, our quest for satisfaction, our building of palazzi, such as this one, is the sign of a profound homesickness. The pain of our return to a home we don't know, but we know it must exist, our lost paradise. Dante, however, did not start writing the Divine Comedy in 1300, when he was totally involved in Florentine politics. According to the best evidence that we have, Dante began writing the comedy around 1308, when he was in exile, out of Florence, away from the sweet sheepfold, as he calls it. Dante was banished from Florence in 1302, January 1302, and finding himself already out of the city, he never returned home. When he died in Ravenna 20 years later, in 1321, having just completed his great poem, his body was laid to rest there. And there he still is, despite the attempts at Florence tribes of getting back home. Too late! Too late. The poem was probably conceived, at least in its initial stages, as a passport back to Florence. Its creation was, or certainly became, in a real sense, the result of its author's exile. Having been banned from active politics, Dante resorted to poetry as a surrogate, or if you will, as a way to sublimate a desire to change Florence and the world that was totally frustrated by the reality of his life. However, the poem is also, if not above all, inspired by the notion of human life as exile from our true home. It is then to this double exile from heaven and from Florence that we owe the comedy, the Divine Comedy. Excluded from Florence in 1302, Dante longs to return to her. His exile is hard and humiliating. Around 1305, as he's writing one of so-called minor works, the Convivio, he writes, first text, poi che fu piacere degli cittadini della bellissima e famosissima figlia di Roma, from the time when the citizens of Rome's most beautiful and famous daughter, Florence, saw fit to cast me away from her sweet bosom, where I was born and nourished until my full maturity, and where with her gracious consent I desire with all my heart to rest my weary mind and complete my allotted span, I have made my way through almost all the regions to which this language extends, a homeless wanderer, reduced almost to beggary, and showing against my will the wound inflicted by fortune, which is very often imputed unjustly to the one afflicted. I have indeed been a ship, lacking sail and rudder, carried to various ports and river mouths and shores by the parching wind raised by painful poverty. Veramente io sono stato legno senza vela e senza governo, portato a diversi porti e foci e viti dal vento secco che evapora la dolorosa povertate. But Dante is not prepared to return to Florence at any cost. 10 years later, in 1315, he was given the opportunity to return, but the conditions were too humiliating for him. This is a text of a letter originally in Latin to a friend who who wrote to him announcing the availability of this pardon, subject to the oblation, to a admission of wrong on Dante's part. Listen what he writes, 1315. This then is the gracious recall of Dante Alighieri to his native city, after the miseries of well-nigh 15 years of exile. This is the reward of innocence manifest to all the world, and of the sweat and toil of unremitting study. Far be from a familiar philosophy such a senseless act of abasement as to submit himself to be presented at the oblation, like a felon in bonds. Far be it from the preacher of justice, after suffering wrong, to pay of his money to those that wronged him, as though they had deserved well of him. No, my father, this is how he calls this friend of his, not by this path will I return to my native city. If some other can be found, in the first place by yourself and thereafter by others, which does not derogate from the fame and honor of Dante, that will I tread with no lagging steps. But if by no such path Florence may be entered, then will I enter Florence never. What? Can I not anywhere gaze upon the face of the sun and the stars? Can I not under any sky contemplate the most precious truths, without I first return to Florence, disgraced, nay, dishonored in the eyes of my fellow citizens? Assuredly, bread will not fail me. Dante was too proud to accept conditions requiring him to admit any personal guilt. His moral conviction was so strong that he actually required the reverse. He required that Florence recognize her wrong, her guilt towards him. And besides, by 1315, the poem was very well advanced. And even if it began as a means to an end, at that point, really, the poem had become an end in itself. Ultimately, even more important than going back to Florence. In addition to the existential and historical journeys, then there is a third urgent challenge that confronts Dante in 1315, the completion of his poem. Indeed, at this point, journey home and journey to heaven can exist only if the journey towards the poem runs its full course. These three dimensions, existential, historical, and literary, are interwoven throughout the poem, and I would say throughout Dante's life. And by 1315, the poem is brimming with Dante's contempt for Florence. The poet does not spare other Italian cities his invective. Think of Pistoia. Here you have the text with the translation: Ai Pistoia, Pistoia, che non stanzi di incenerarti, sì che più non duri poiché in malfare il seme tuo avanzi, or Pisa. Ah, Pisa, shame of the peoples of the fair land, where sounds the sea. Since your neighbors are slow to punish you, make Capraia and Gorgona, the two islands just outside the mouth of the Apple, make Capraia and Gorgona shift and put a bar on the Arno's mouth so that it drown every soul in you. Genoa. Ah, Genoese, people strange to all good custom and full of all corruption, why are you not driven from the world? Or the Italy herself, ah, Italy enslaved, hostel of misery, I serva Italia. Di dolore ostello, nave senza nocchiere in gran tempesta, non donna di province, ma bordello. Not a princess among the provinces, but a brothel. Dante thrashes Italy, attacks the church for its worldly ambitions, shames the emperor for having abandoned the garden of the empire, and bitterly remarks that God himself seems to pay little attention to the fate of the peninsula. He keeps this his heaviest sarcasm for Florence. Florence, a stepmother rather than a mother, proud, unjust, quarrelsome, violent, foolish, voluble, and very sick. Rejoice, Florence, he writes at the beginning of Canto 26 of Inferno, having just seen how many Florentines are among the thieves punished in hell. Rejoice, since you are so great, he says, that over land and sea you beat your wings, and through hell your name is spread about. At the heart of the comedy is Florence. There is no doubt about it, as metaphor of hell and universal center, at once longed for and rejected, of what I call the new culture of material desire. In effect, of the 79 souls Dante meets in hell, 32 are Florentine and 11 Tuscan. While in purgatory there are only 4 Florentines, and in paradise, apart from Beatrice, just 3 made it to paradise. But apart from the contingent and partisan charges that were responsible for his exile, what motivates Dante's contempt for his native cities? His native cities. To be blunt and put it in a nutshell, I called it the new culture of material desire. You can also call it Florence's greed. Or what Dante calls Florence's greed. Indeed, the restless beast, the bestia senza pace, that in the first scene of Inferno makes Dante turn back from the hillside, setting the pulses trembling in his veins, the beast that lets no man pass away, but hinders them till she takes their life, is neither leopard nor lion, but a she-wolf, charged with all cravings, not a personal obsession, but an animal whose nature is so vicious and malignant that her appetite is never satisfied, and after food she's hungrier than before. Dante identifies this animal who appears to him at the very beginning of his journey, or rather just before he begins his journey. He identifies this animal as the worst of illnesses, incurable, he says, until the greyhound and mysterious Veltro, mysterious redeemer of humble Italy, will come to bring her to miserable death. It is thus a political sickness, almost par excellence, which is responsible, according to Dante, for the serious social and moral crisis in which Florence, Italy, and the entire world find themselves in the year 1300. And soon also for the exile in which the poet will have to spend the rest of his life. However, Dante wrote the comedy not merely to castigate Florence, also indeed, or principally, to reform and reconquer her. His journey towards the completion of his sacred poem, Il Poema Sacro, as he calls it, is in his intentions and hopes also a journey back to his Florentine fatherland. It may seem strange, but Dante looks at Florence just as he looks at the church, with both contempt and love. Love for the city as a community capable of fulfilling in principle all human potential for good. Contempt for its people and administrators, all equally corrupted by their craving for power and wealth. But as with the church, Dante's attitude is hardly radical, in the sense that he attacks the Florentines and their government just as he attacks the church and all the clergy, but not the city as an institution, not the church as an institution. And just as he asks that the church turn back the clock and divest itself of its riches and temporal power, so he would have Florence return to former simplicity and sobriety of life and customs. As we will see in a minute, the Dantean utopia of the early church corresponds to the Dantean utopia of olden Florence. The poem, then, is born out of Dante's desire to prove the inevitability of his exile, given the state of present-day Florence, but also to end that exile, while fighting back, expressing the pain, soothing the still bleeding wound of distance and separation. Unfortunately, the more he writes, the more he compromises his chances of return, his chances of being allowed back. The poem is a declaration of militant politics, which is fatally destined not to resolve the conflict between Dante and his birthplace, but rather to exacerbate it. Let me now give you some examples of Dante's analysis of what was going on in Florence. In Canto 16 of Inferno, Dante tells of how he met three noble Florentines in the seventh circle, the circle of violence against nature. They had been sentenced there for practicing sodomy. But Dante and Virgil treat them with unusual respect. These three, you remember, like, all the damned, condemned in this part of the circle, the violent, are subjected to an uninterrupted rain of fire, and they walk over fiery sand and are subjected to this rain of fire, constant rain of fire. Rather, it looks like snow, Dante says, but it is fire that falls on them all the time. Anyway, Virgil and Dante, Virgil is accompanying Dante, but of course, Virgil and Dante treat these characters with great respect. What is behind this respect is the fact that these three souls are the only ones in hell to be anxious, not about the loss of power on the part of their families or parties, but about the decline of the civil and moral values currently afflicting Florence. This, in fact, is the only aspect of Florentine life which they ask about as soon as they meet Dante in hell. This is their question, number 5. Tell us if courtesy and valor abide in our city, as they did. Cortesia e valor disse dimora nella nostra città sì come suole, o se del tutto se ne gita fuori. At which the Florentine Dante, just arrived in the fiction of the story from Florence, burst out, addressing not his interlocutors, but Florence herself. So he talks to Florence directly. And with unusual feeling, what does he say? The text that follows. La gente nuova e subiti guadagni, orgoglio di smisura han generata, fiorenza in te, sì che tu già te impiagni. The new people and the sudden gains have begotten new Florence, arrogance and excess, so that already you weep for it. For the first time in the Divine Comedy, Dante contrasts two antithetical lifestyles, two opposite economic, ethical, and political models. On the one hand, courtesy and valor, virtues of the past. And on the other, arrogance and excess, vices of the present. The evils of the Florentine depraved land, as he calls it a few lines later. The root and cause of this process of degeneration evoked in the middle of the Inferno was for Dante a historical phenomenon of an economic and social nature, brought about by what? By human greed. It's a phenomenon that he calls la gente nuova e subiti guadagni. In other words, the new people and their search for wealth that had devastated the civil and moral life of the city. A little historical background now, very, very simple, but quite impressive, really. By new people, la gente nuova, Dante means the population of the surrounding areas, surrounding Florence, who in the 50 or 100 years before 1300, driven by the desire for a better life, had come to look for it in increasingly prosperous Florence, and by coming into Florence, made Florence more prosperous too. In little more than a century, the Florentine population had grown from 30,000 in 1200 to 50,000 in 1250 to 100,000 in 1300. A real metropolis at the time. With the sudden gains, so this is for the new people, this is what it means, this growth in populations, this inurbation, the coming into the city of people from the countryside. With the sudden gains, subiti guadagni, he refers to the rapid enrichment of individuals and families with or without pedigree, but well endowed with the ability to exploit the favorable economic situation. Dante thus has in mind the parvenu, the nouveau riche of the late 13th century. This phenomenon was of the greatest importance in the precocious development of the Florentine commune from aristocratic to bourgeois or popular, meaning by popular very much in inverted comma, bankers, merchants, manufacturers, rather than proletarians or even artisans, though they too were favored by the economic transformations of the city. By 1300, the old nobility, the old Ghibelline nobility in particular, traditionally loyal to the emperor, had been totally defeated, and Florence was dominated by the industrial and mercantile upper middle class. This new class had extended the city's control to the whole of Tuscany and developed values such as free initiative, individual enterprise, pragmatic intelligence, and so forth, all positive values for us, that had profoundly changed life in the city. The speed of this transformation can be grasped by considering the rise of the golden florin, the accursed fiore, the accursed florin, Dante calls it, which the florin, the coin that first minted in Florence in 1252, in just 50 years had conquered the European markets. Literally, it was the dollar of the Trecento. And monetary, or rather in a very short time, new energies were released. A new dynamism, a new social and geographic mobility had swept away the order of the past. The style of life had changed. A monetary economy had triumphed where only shortly before money hardly existed. In short, what would eventually be known as capitalism was born. An economic order that undoubtedly had given a new hope of betterment to some, had enlarged the social basis of power, had rendered the Florentine government potentially more democratic or meritocratic, if you will, had even created new cultural needs to which Dante himself had responded with his writings in the vernacular, but had also exacerbated internal discord instead of reducing it, and above all, at least to Dante's eyes, had profoundly corrupted Florentine public and private life. Of all these profound and irreversible changes, the changes that were ultimately responsible for the Renaissance, for the Florence that we admire today, that we love today, and that provides the foundations of the Florence that we actually know. Of all these profound irreversible changes, a real and true anthropological mutation, Dante sees only the negative aspects and internal contradictions, which indeed existed. Recalling Cicero, he writes in the Convivio, "And what imperils," this is number 6, "and what imperils and destroys cities, territories, and individuals day by day more than the accumulation of wealth by some new person. Such an accumulation uncovers new desires which cannot be satiated without causing injury to someone." I must make it clear that Dante was not against the human quest for happiness on earth, but he objected to the notion that the acquisition of wealth and power could make people more fulfilled and happier. He never entertained the idea that the social conflicts of his time could pave the way for a new, more just and democratic society, or that any movement, whether individual or collective, which aimed at earthly well-being independently of humanity's eternal destiny, could ultimately be positive. The supreme good for civil society does not lie, according to Dante, in equality nor in social progress, concepts that are foreign to the beliefs of his time and to his worldview. Dante does not consider this, does not think in those terms at all. That they are terms that do not exist in Dante's vocabulary. Dante considers the supreme good for civil society lies in universal peace. Universal peace. Inasmuch as universal peace is the best of those things which are ordained for human happiness. Florence, on the contrary, was for him the embodiment of a society that had lost its way, a society which, by obsessively seeking heaven on earth, had made hell of life on earth. Let's move to Paradiso, to the third canticle, and to the meeting, one of the greatest meetings that Dante has, fictional meeting that he has in the comedy, an encounter with his great-great-grandfather, Cacciaguida. He's got a strange name. He's the only Cacciaguida I know and that I've ever known in my life. It's called Cacciaguida. Cacciaguida, whom Dante meets in heaven, in Paradiso, endorses from heaven the position that the three noble Florentines, the three sodomites, took at the center of the Inferno. In the three central cantos of Paradiso, Dante's political, ethical vision finds its most intense poetic as well as ideologically most organic expression. Now, Cacciavida probably would, there are some documents that prove that he actually existed, Cacciavida. But Dante hardly knew anything about him at all. In the comedy, he appears as a mythical figure, part of a very remote world that Dante constructs. He is, in effect, Dante's alter ego, an alias, in the sense that the poet creates to give full expression and to legitimate his feelings about Florence. See, so this is what Cacciavida says. In Canto 15, text number 8, Cacciavida traces the origins of the Alighieri, Dante's family, but the greater part of his discourse is made up of an elegiac parenthesis in which he evokes the Florence d'antan, the olden Florence. Florence, Fiorenza, dentro dalla cerchia antica, onde la toglia ancora e terza e nona si stava in pace, sobria e pudica. Pace, peace, sobriety, pudicizia, chastity, modesty. And Dante then continues, listing with polemical nostalgia all the things that in that Florence were not done, did not happen, and instead are, do happen now. Text number 9. This is a description of rather fashionable ladies in the year 1300. Non avea catenella, non corona, non gonne contigiate, non cintura che fosse a veder più che la persona. He tells us what is being worn by contemporary Florentine women, but was not being worn by the modest, of course, women of Cacciavida's days. No necklace and no coronal were there, and no embroidered gowns. There was no girdle that caught the eye more than the one who wore it. No daughter's birth brought fear unto her father, for age and dowry then did not imbalance to this side and to that the proper measure. There were no families that bore no children, and Sardanapalus was still a stranger, not come as yet to teach in the bedchamber, a mostrar ciò che in camera si puote. Dante uses the Florentine women's taste for luxury as a foil to illustrate the integrity of the old city and the degeneration of the contemporary one. For Dante, women's customs are the thermometer of public health, which is very poorly now that women go about showing their breasts, their bodies covered in chains, richly adorned skirts and belts, a far cry from when they dedicated themselves to home and family and the integrity reigned in public life. Text number 10. Here is just a scene from the days from Cacciavida's day. Women, see what they did. One kept watch, tending the cradle, and soothing her child, would use the tongue that first delights fathers and mothers. Another, drawing the tresses from the distaff, would tell among her family tales of the Trojans, of Fiesole and Rome. In that peaceful, sober, modest city, Cacciavida was born, writes Dante, and his civic and moral virtues freely grew and prospered. Knighted by Emperor Conrad III, he followed him to the Holy Land and died fighting the infidel. The life and death of Cacciavida are the product and mirror of the city in which he was born and lived. For Dante, the virtues of the communities are communicated to each citizen, and in turn, each citizen contributes to his and her good work, to the good order of the community. Cacciaguida offers a full illustration of this principle in the next canto, Canto 16, where he again contrasts modern with old Florence, the peace, moderation, and simplicity of the past against the excesses and corruption of the present. La gente nuova e subiti guadagni, the new people and sudden gains of Inferno 16, find here their definitive gloss. And it is with almost a physical disgust that the poet, using his ancestor as mouthpiece, mentions the stench of the boar from Aguglione and captures in a pitiless close-up the expression of him from Signa, who already has a sharp eye for graft, for corrupting and being corrupted, for barter. So deep is Dante's aversion for this new class of merchants come from the countryside to pollute the purity of the old city. Dante's conclusion leaves no illusion as to his feelings about social and geographical mobility. Sempre la confusione delle persone. Text number 11, and I'm surprised some political parties haven't chosen these 3 lines as their motto. Today, not only in Italy, sempre la confusione delle persone, principio fu del mal della città, come del no vostro, il cibo che s'appone, the mixture of people, was ever the beginning of the city's ills, as food in excess is of the bodies. Not lines that are often mentioned in the public squares by Dante scholars. It is in the context of this ethical and civil contrast that Dante locates his own exile. His exile makes sense in this context. In Cacciaguida's city, in that modest, quiet, peaceful, sober city, Dante would have lived in peace and with honor. But in contemporary Florence, he could not live without compromising his integrity. His exile, then, is not a mere case of temporary injustice, but rather the sign of the radical decadence of the city that exiled him. It makes perfect sense, then, that it should be Cacciaguida, his ancestor, his most honorable ancestor, to forecast Dante's exile and explain its inevitability. Text 12, which we were made to learn by heart when we at school, particularly in primary schools and then in scuole medie, qual si partio Ippolito d'Atene per la spietata e perfida Noverca, tal di Fiorenza, partirti convene, as Hippolytus was forced to flee from Athens because of his stepmother, treacherous and fierce, so shall you be forced to flee from Florence. You shall leave behind all you most dearly love, and that shall be the arrow first loosed from the exiled bow. You shall learn how salt is the taste of another man's bread, and how hard is the way going down and up another man's stairs. Tu proverai sì come sa di sale lo pane altrui, e come duro calle lo scendere il salir per l'altrui scale. An experience that Dante was undergoing as he was writing this, because, as I said earlier, the journey described in the poem is set in 1300, but these are words that probably Dante set down around, I would say, 1318, 1319. We don't know exactly, but certainly close to his death. Yet, despite all this, Dante did not cease longing, imagining and dreaming to return to Florence, and being given the recognition he felt he deserved. This is how it begins Canto 25 of Paradiso, text 13. Se mai continga che il poema sacro al quale ha posto mano e cielo e terra sì che m'ha fatto per molti anni macro, vinca la crudeltà che fuor mi serra del bello vile ov'io dormì agnello, nimico ai lupi che gli danno guerra. Con altra voce omai, con altro vello ritornerò poeta e in sul fonte del mio battesimo prenderò il cappello. Those are the conditions at which Dante would return. He would return only if in this bel San Giovanni he were given the title of poet and were treated with the honor that he deserved. Far from be from him to admit any wrongdoing. Now, let's go back to the Florence that Dante imagines, the Florence of the past that Dante imagines. We know that the sober and chaste Florence described by Cacciaguida is none other than Dante's daydream, the projection into the remote past of a model impossible for the future. In fact, we can see clearly now how the seeds of the social-economic development abhorred by the poet were sown precisely by that Florence that he wished to revive. Dante is clear in his mind that a society founded on money, on the separation of public and private, and of the useful from the honest, will never produce the spiritual fruit that he expects from civil society. On the other hand, the contented immobility that he imagines to be the only alternative, while perhaps sufficient for those who are and have something, offers little hope to those who have nothing. We must say that. Looking back at it now, with the advantage of hindsight, Dante's noble and severe vision is narrow and conservative, in that it accepts and approves the possession, but not the acquisition of goods. It is a vision of society as a static structure, suspended in an ideal equilibrium, ordained by divine providence. A couple of minutes and I'll be done. Florence last appears in the poem when Dante recalls his amazement on arriving at the highest heaven, his spiritual home, his heavenly home, the Empyrean. Text 14. I, who had come to the divine from the human, to the eternal from time, and from Florence to a people just and sane. With what amazement must I have been filled, io che al divino, dall'umano all'eterno dal tempo era venuto, e di Fiorenza in popolo giusto e sano, di che stupore doveva essere compiuto. These powerful lines bear witness to the end of a long illusion. The third line, e di Fiorenza in popolo giusto e sano, subtly inverting the order of those preceding it, an excruciating addition. Fiorenza is synonymous with hell, the point in the universe furthest from justice and moral health, from the greatest good, from God. In the fiction of the poem, there is a journey of just a week, a few days, behind this line of poetry. In Dante's actual experience, there were almost 20 years of tormented and useless waiting. Useless, not perhaps for the poet, who owes the Divine Comedy to his exile, but certainly for the man. The poem, born to provide Dante with a passport home, once completed, becomes instead an obstacle between him and Florence, the reason why his exile cannot end. Thus Dante returns to his heavenly home in the fiction of his Paradiso, but does not return to Florence. It is the price he must pay for his moral intransigence and his poetic genius. Thank you.